It's been about 2 weeks now since the Archbishop Rowan Williams here in Britain made his, I would say, rather unfortunate reference to the fact that Shariah law can be accommodated or certainly incorporated within British civil law. Now that has caused a huge amount of outcry around the world, and I know most of you who are watching this know already what is being said. I don't need to repeat it. He did not really talk about all of Islamic law. He pinpointed basically marriage, divorce, and inheritance. And I, who have to work with Muslims all the time, when I was looking, and I was saying, where did the Archbishop, is he aware of what the Quran says concerning these aspects? You don't have to go very far. Just go to Surah 4. In the 4th Surah, in Surah 4, Ayah 3, it says very simply that a man may have up to 4 wives. Not a woman may have up to 4 husbands. That would be polyandry, but a man may have up to 4 wives. That's called polygamy. We don't allow that here in Britain. Polygamy is not accepted for very good reasons, and so I would like to know how the Archbishop thinks that that could be incorporated into British civil law. Just a few verses on, in verse 11 of Surah 4, it says that a woman has half the inheritance of a man. Now, is that acceptable under British civil law? Absolutely not, and I don't know how he would assume or even consider that that could be accommodated by British civil law. If you were to go on for a few more verses down further to verse 34, it says very clearly that a woman is protected by a man, that if she stands against her husband, then he may first admonish her, and if that doesn't work, then he may throw her from his bed, and if that doesn't work, then he may beat her. Darab, scourge is the word that is used. Certainly that could not be accommodated by British civil law. Thank God that would not be accommodated by British civil law. I'm not sure where the Archbishop could try to look for accommodation there. As far as divorce is concerned, the Quran is very clear that a man may divorce a wife simply by saying talak, the talak, which means I divorce you 3 times, in front of a witness, and that's all it would take, and that would mean that the divorce would be settled. If a woman wanted to do the same thing, she could not do that. She would not be able to say talak, talak, talak 3 times. She would have to go to arbitration. She would have to go to an Islamic court. She would have to go to a male-dominated Islamic court. Women do not sit on those courts. And then seek for arbitration, seek for counsel amongst them, and they could decide whether or not she could have divorce. And most often than not, as we saw in the Dispatches program 3 weeks ago, where that was actually exemplified, showed how it works here in Britain. In almost every case they showed, none of the women got their divorce, not initially, until it was obvious in almost every case that there was so much violence that they had to finally get it. So I'm not sure where the Archbishop was going on this. I don't know really how he's going to try to find accommodation. I don't think he really thought through the ramifications of what he was saying, and I think now he probably rused the day that he came up with those references so casually. In his case, so academically, and in many instances, I think when you come out with academic tomes like that, you sometimes miss the point on a popular level. But here's what I want to talk about, and this is what I think is more important. It's not so much the initial reaction that I find surprising. It's what has happened since then, in the 2 weeks since then, and what seems to be ongoing now. And I've been looking at the papers, and I've been following the stories, and I've been finding that there has been a trend. Initially, there was certainly almost all the newspapers talked about Shariah law, tried to understand it. This one here, comment says British women are already suffering from Islamic law, and gave instance after instance here in Britain how they are suffering because of the inequality that comes out. Here's a picture of Rowan Williams himself, and it says here in the Daily Telegraph that Britain must reject this craven counsel of despair, and it says it very clearly, this would be a counsel of despair because of the inequality that would have been imposed on the women. And there's the Anglican Church itself, it says here, there's an unease in the Anglican Church, according to this article, saying that almost 90 to 97% of the Anglican constituency rejected what the Archbishop was implying. And of course the ramifications of what that meant to their Britain. Not only the Anglican Church, here's another article that talks about O'Connor, the head of the Catholic Church, came alongside a former Archbishop, Carey, to denounce what the Archbishop was saying. But then they started to change, and this was interesting. Last week, then, the articles started to change. Instead of hearing vilification against the Archbishop, suddenly you got articles like this, where it says that there are 17,000 attacks on women every year. Women, what we call honor crimes. And then it started looking at some of these women. Here you can see a picture of one of these 17,000. And it mentions that this figure could be possibly as much as 35% higher than that. And then it started looking at these women here. These pictures of women who have committed suicide. And it says that in the Asian community, the British Asian community, that means Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, amongst the ages of 16 to 24, there are 3 times more likely women in that age bracket to kill themselves than the national average. That means women who are Asian community in that age bracket are 3 times more likely to kill themselves. Suicide. Honor killings. What's that got to do with Islamic law? What's that got to do with Sharia law? Rather, outside of being indirectly, you might say, indirectly responsible to Islamic law, but certainly something was changing here, and I noticed this in the press. No decent law allows coercion, and then of course it went into some of the examples of the coercion, and then almost all the papers ran this story just last week, which talks about ministers who warn of inbred Muslims. And it said here that Muslims, though they make up only 3% of the population here in Britain, yet 33% of all children born with genetic illnesses come from within their population. They only make up 3%, yet 33% of all genetic illnesses come out of Muslim families here in Britain. What's that got to do with Islamic law? What's that got to do with what the Archbishop was saying? And I had to scratch my head, and on suddenly I realized what was going on. Maybe you see it as well. This really does have nothing to do with a former argument, but it has everything to do with a simmering feeling of threat that's going on here in Britain. It's happening in the West. It's happening right across Europe. See, there are many people living here who have a problem with Islam because of the way it imposes itself, not only religiously, not only socially, not only economically, politically, in every area of life. And the fact that it's imposing itself on the public sphere, and the fact that a religion which should be a private faith is imposing itself publicly on people, and yet there's nothing we can say or do anything about it, because if we were to say something publicly, if any of these articles, these journals or any of these journalists were to say so publicly, that would be called Islamophobia, and there are laws that would impugn upon them. And because of the fact that they cannot say this publicly, they don't. And usually we don't see these kind of stories. Not so vivid and not so numerous until the Archbishop said what he said. Once the Archbishop said that, it gave a vehicle for the journals and for the journalists to vent basically what they've been wanting to say all along, but could not do so because of what might happen to them. As you can see, what happened to Salman Rushdie, or Taslima Nasreen, or Taha Hussein, or Fazlur Rahman. These are people who had tried to go out public and say what they wanted to say things that were injurious to Islam, and of course many of them either had to leave their country or they had fatwas put on their heads, and some of them, like Taha Hussein, were killed. Of course, nobody wants to do that. And of course now, most recently with the Muhammad cartoons and the teddy bear named Muhammad there in Sudan, you can see that in almost every case, anytime a journalist or anytime a private citizen tries to say something publicly and gets vilified like that and gets threatened like that, it censors this kind of material. But once the Archbishop said what he said, it gave opportunity for all this venting to go on, this simmering frustration that's gurgling there just below the surface. Muslims need to pay attention to that. I think you Muslims need to be aware of the frustration that your religion is causing in the West. And that it's these kind of publications, this kind of reaction that you should expect, and you're going to see more and more of it. Oh, they're not going to say so publicly, they're not going to say it so right out in front, because we see the repercussions of what happens. But it should not surprise you that when the Archbishop says something that's really quite neutral, that this enormous amount of vilification that comes against him, which is really not against him, it's really against you. And what you're doing, how you're imposing yourselves on us publicly in every area of life. I know this is going to open up a huge debate, and I know many of you will want to talk about it, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of responses on YouTube to what I'm saying here. But I'm the vehicle again. I'm the vehicle just basically interpreting what I see in the last 2 weeks, and I think this is going to continue and continue and continue. I leave that to you now. I'd like to see your type of responses. Let's open this debate, and let's see where we go from there. All right, this is Jay then, over and out.